Some of you know the record of transmitting the light by Dogen Zenji. This is a great collection of stories of our Zen ancestors in the Soto Zen tradition. The stories of their lives, but focusing on their pivotal moment of awakening. And this record begins with Shakyamuni Buddha and his story, and then the stories of all the Indian ancestors and the Chinese Soto Zen ancestors up through Dogen Zenji and his disciple Koun Ejo. And then it stops, because it was recorded by Keizan, who is the Dharma grandson of Ejo. So I greatly appreciate these stories. I think they're inspiring for our own practice to hear how the ancestors practiced, and their pivotal awakening stories are also great inspiration and inform. Each one forms like a koan. It's generally what the koan stories are. Is a dialogue encounter in which someone has a shift of perspective and awakens to the way, whether small shift or big shift. The ones that are worth recording got recorded. So since this record of transmitting the light only goes through ancestor Ejo, I thought it would be nice to look at some of the ancestors that didn't get recorded in that record, continuing on. So Koun Ejo's disciple is Tettsu Gikai. So this is kind of like an appendix to the Denko Roku transmission of light, the stories that continue beyond. So today we have the story of Tetsugikai. And partly I feel just inspired to bring it up because it was recently translated by a friend of mine, Dosho Port Roshi. It was an earlier translation by Thomas Cleary, but it wasn't quite as complete. This is from a different source. So this is also, I think, interesting because the Zen tradition at this time had just entered Japan. It was a new thing. It was just in the first few decades, really, or first 50 years of Zen in Japan. It was a new thing. It was a renegade movement. People were trying to establish this new radical practice and verification of Zen. And it's kind of like our time in America. We're in the first 50 years. We're trying to establish this tradition. So maybe we have something in common a little bit with these ancestors from the 13th and 14th century. So Tetsugikai, whose name could be translated in various ways, like thoroughly pervading Tetsu, and forerunner in conduct is Gikai. One way to say it. That's his Dharma name, and he was from Etsu province in Japan, and from the Fujiwara clan, and he was born in 1219. Just for perspective, Dogen is kind of Dharma grandfather. Tetsugikai did practice with Dogen. Dogen was born in 1200, so Gikai is 19 years younger. And at age 13, Gikai's head was shaved by Akon. Akon was a teacher in the what we call the Dharma shu, Japanese way of saying the Bodhidharma school. So it's an interesting part of particularly Soto Zen early history in Japan is this Dharma shu, this other school of Zen that was starting in this time when Zen was just beginning. The Dharma shu died out after just a decade, maybe. It didn't really last. But it was happening at the same time. It was a popular movement happening at the same time as Dogen was trying to establish his Zen. And a lot of teachers and students from the Dharma shu ended up just joining Dogen's community. That was kind of how his early Zen community kind of got filled out with these people from Dharma shu kind of like felt like they were a little bit off track, and they felt like Dogen was more on track. A little bit unusual. Kind of like in Shakyamuni Buddha's time, there were these other schools of yogis and practitioners in India, and sometimes one of them would be like, wow, this Shakyamuni Buddha is onto something. So that teacher would kind of join the Buddha's community, and that all their students would also have to come along, sometimes hundreds in the Buddha's case. So it's a little bit like that, maybe. And Akon, who was a teacher in the Dharma shu, who ordained Tetsugikai at age 13. They started young in those days. He happened to have this temple that was very like next door to where Dogen's temple, Eiheiji, would later be built. So it's probably not coincidence. There's probably some connection between this Dharma shu temple and practitioners, and then Dogen's looking for a place in the mountains to build a temple, and they have this connection through people like Akon and Tetsugikai. So also like Koon Ejo, who would later become a teacher for Tetsugikai, he was also started in the Dharma shu. And later all these people, Ejo, Gikai, and Akon, Gikai's teacher, they all kind of joined Dogen's community. And this part is not in the shorter translated story, but I'm kind of fleshing out some historical details that I think are kind of interesting. It turns out that just before Akon, that's this Gikai's original teacher, just before Akon died, he gave Dharma transmission to Tetsugikai, even though they were both practicing in Dogen's temple at that time. And apparently this was done with Dogen's blessing. Dogen really respected Akon, even though he had some problems with the Dharma shu in general. The people who came to practice with him, I think he got to know them and deeply respected their practice. So it's another interesting piece of history that there's Dogen's Soto lineage that he brought from China going on in his Dogen's temple. And then there's this Dharma shu lineage, and they're even doing Dharma transmission in this other lineage in Dogen's temple while Dogen's alive, with Dogen's blessing. So that's kind of I think, an interesting picture of kind of non-sectarianism. Everyone's trying to establish this new Zen movement, and they all have slightly different versions of it, but they're doing it together. So that was Tetsu Gikai's novice ordination at age 13. And then the next year, at age 14, Gikai ascended the auspicious peak of Mount Hiei and received full ordination, the Bodhisattva precepts there. And so Mount Hiei was then and still is the headquarters of the Tendai school, another important movement of Buddhism in Japan, still thriving. It's different than Zen, but it's related. And Dogen was also ordained in the Tendai tradition and later kind of converted to Zen. So it's interesting to me that after the year after Gikai got ordained as a Zen novice monk, he went to this other training monastery on Mount Hiei. Probably his teacher sent him. Maybe they didn't have a place to practice. So he's like, you should go learn the Tendai teachings. And they have a big, huge mountain, thriving monastery. So go there. I imagine it's probably like that. And there on Mount Hiei, Gikai studied the Tendai teaching and surrendered to the responsibilities of the precepts. He carefully studied and illuminated the Sharangama Sutra and the Pure Land Sutras. So kind of eclectic Dharma education in his early years. And then at age 23, so it sounds like Gikai was practicing Tendai on Mount Hiei for 9 years. And at 23, Gikai changed his robes and began practicing with teacher Dogen at Koshoji, Dogen's first monastery. Change his robes means like his style of practice. They probably had a slightly different style of robe even. And he picked up Zen again, which he had started 9 years earlier. And his teacher, Akon, also joined Dogen's community. So the record says Gikai was dedicated and wholehearted in his practice. And one day, Dogen went up to the hall to give a talk and said, "This Dharma abides in its Dharma position." Or each Dharma, each phenomena, Dharma can mean like thing or phenomena or experience. I think is the case here. Each Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances of the world forever abide. Spring colors, hundreds of red flowers. High in the willow, a partridge calls. And upon hearing this, Tetsugikai had an awakening. His perspective suddenly shifted in a direct and experiential way. What happened? What did he hear there? So that's a pivotal moment for Tetsugikai. And I think we can this morning explore this story in more depth. I think it's a great Zen koan to investigate. But before we do, let me just finish the circumstances of Tetsugikai's life. story here. So just a year after that awakening at Koshoji, Dogen moved his temple from Kyoto, in the capital, in the city there. He moved out to the mountains and started building a heiji. No one's quite sure exactly what happened, but it seems like there was politics involved and maybe competition with this Tendai school. Tendai school didn't like this new budding movement of Zen going on nearby Mount Hiei. It could be that that's why they moved out to the mountains. Also, Dogen loved the mountains. So Dogen's whole little community moved out to the mountains right near the Rumushu teacher Eikan's original temple. And Tetsugikai served as Tenzo, the head cook, and then as treasurer. The record says every day he managed many issues for the assembly, and every night he sat zazen until dawn. I don't know if he slept sometimes too. Dogen saw that he could apply his aspiration. Dogen would always slap his thigh and say, "A true Dharma vessel, someday Gikai will certainly spread my Dharma widely." So Dogen praised Gikai, but also, this is in other records, it said that Dogen also told Gikai that he needs to cultivate a grandmotherly mind. So he greatly praised Gikai, but he also had a little feedback. And he apparently said this at 3 different occasions to Gikai. You really have great practice, but you have to cultivate this grandmother mind. So I'm not sure exactly what he meant. And in fact, Gikai says in his own recording of this, I'm not sure exactly what Dogen meant, but he said this to me 3 times. I should develop grandmother mind. Maybe something about deep, caring kindness and compassion for his fellow practitioners. He probably had some, but maybe Dogen felt like he should be even more loving, maybe. This will come up again a little bit later, this grandmother mind issue. So after Dogen died, then Kon Ejo took over as abbot and asked Gikai to be the Shuso, the head student, for a while. And during this time, Gikai was apparently working with the story of Dogen's awakening, which when Dogen heard this phrase, drop off body and mind, Dogen dropped off body and mind. When he heard his teacher in China say that phrase. So that was well known, apparently, this, amongst the students of Dogen. So one modern scholar says, putting together different pieces and stories recorded by different people, that it looks like Ejo had assigned his student Gikai this koan, body and mind drop off, this to kind of like take up this saying and dig into it, really investigate this saying, which is interesting because usually we think of Dogen's doesn't emphasize like taking up koans in zazen as a kind of formal practice. But like this scholar who wrote about this said, some modern Soto people don't like this story because it looks like they were kind of using this koan method in Dogen's time in Soto Zen. So in any case, whether whether it just popped into Gikai's mind while he was sitting, whether he was really working with this thing, drop off body and mind. He had some kind of shift, and he hurried to the teacher's room. His teacher is now Koan Ejo. Dogen has died. And he said to his teacher, Ejo, today someone attained realization through Dogen's words. Body and mind dropped off. And the teacher, Ejo, said, one version says, what did you do to give birth to this realization? And another translation says, well, so how do you understand dropping off body and mind? And Gikai said something like, I knew the barbarian's beard is red, but here's another red bearded barbarian. And he didn't make this up. This is a quote from another old Chinese Zen story with Baijian and Huangbo. So Huangbo expresses himself to his teacher, Baijian, and Baijian approves Huangbo's expression by saying the same line. I knew that the barbarian had a red beard, but here's another red bearded barbarian. That was his Zen way of approving his students' understanding back in the old days. So, these sayings circulated around. That's why it's nice to talk about them now, so they can circulate around this country. The red bearded barbarian is a way of talking about Bodhidharma, the Zen founder who brought Zen from India to China. And apparently, it's kind of funny because Indians usually don't have red beards. That's what they thought of Bodhidharma. He did have a beard in the pictures of him. So this way of approving the student was to say something kind of like, well, I knew that Bodhidharma was like an awakened one. Here's another awakened one. Maybe a little bit like that. It's the feeling of this funny Zen phrase. So that was in old China, that was Baijian saying this to Huangbo. But now Gikai, when he's asked many centuries later in Japan, how do you understand this dropping off body and mind that you've just understood? Gikai says, I knew the barbarian's beard is red, but here's another red-bearded barbarian. So maybe it has some feeling of like, I know that Dogen dropped off body and mind, like Dogen's sort of a filler here for Bodhidharma. But here's another one who dropped off body and mind, me. Sounds a little bit like that. Gikai kind of like saying like, now I realized what Dogen realized. That red-bearded barbarian. Here's another red-bearded barbarian. A very confident thing to say, I think, for Tetsugikai. And his teacher, Ejo, again approved this and said in the record, you are in the realm attained by our former teacher, Dogen, realizing his non-discursive intent, fully knowing his great samadhi, hitting the mark. You have personally experienced final awakening. It's quite an affirmation from Ejo to Gikai. So he had some shift with hearing about the hundreds of red flowers a few years earlier. But this now, Ejo is saying, this is your final awakening. Within the Buddha Dharma, this attainment is most difficult for people. If a person avoids cessation, the Buddha seed does not grow. Even if they become a true person, they're not yet a vessel of Dharma. Inevitably, there must be hardship. The ancient sages struggled with this, and those in the present must also. You are now free from hardship. Today you died and will never again have regrets. But who is it that's still alive? And when Gikai heard this affirmation from his teacher, he tearfully withdrew from the room. And then apparently soon after this, like in the next month, Ejo gave Dharma transmission to Gikai, who already had transmission in the Dharma lineage, so he received another one. And that's why he's one of our ancestors now. So it could be that this whole working with dropped off body and mind as kind of a koan could have been part of the transmission process. Some modern people think this. And also part of this transmission process is all these different letters and records scattered around that are still available. Apparently, Ejo was willing to give this Dharma transmission when Gikai finally realized grandmother mind. That Dogen years before had encouraged him to practice. And strangely, interestingly, I think, part of the story here is that the Dharma shu, and this kind of it was kind of critiqued. The reason why Dharma shu was critiqued in those old days was because it was a little, the scholars use the word now, antinomian. Like it was a little bit like, they kind of taught like, it was really radical non-duality. They taught like everything is Buddha's mind. Everything you do is just expression of awakening. You can't go wrong. That's what the Dharma shu taught. And it wasn't, it wasn't so helpful. Even though there's maybe some truth to that. It was like, well, but what about, doing things that are really harmful to others? Well, it's all just Buddha's mind, so whatever. That was kind of the style of the Dharma shu. And even the people in the Dharma shu eventually realized, I think that's not quite it. So they went to Dogen, who had a slight variation on this teaching. Dogen would say, everything that you do, every, raising of a hand or walking of a foot, done in the dignified decorum of the Buddha way is actually the Buddha way. See, it's slightly different. Dogen's also saying all your mundane actions are also actually an expression of Buddha's mind, but only when they're done with this like dignified deportment. So kind of like, in this case, within the monastic context, that was Dogen's style. We're going to follow the way of the Zen ancestors. And that expression, even though it's just normal stuff like chanting sutras and bowing, but doing it just so, keeping these forms of practice just so. And it's pretty ordinary. It's just the ordinary events in the monastery. That is the expression of awakening. Dogen taught that. That's one way of understanding grandmother mind. That's what Gikai kind of resisted that. It's like, isn't there something else we need besides that? And he and Ejo kind of worked with this. I think he and Dogen worked with it. Gikai and Dogen worked with it, and then Gikai and Ejo worked with this. And finally, Gikai kind of like understood this or affirmed this and deeply trusted this and said something like, I have now attained true confidence in the profound principle that apart from lifting an arm or moving a leg within dignified deportment, there can be no other reality. And that this is actually grandmother mind. In other words, this ordinary activity, being one with our activity, is it. And sometimes Soto Zen gets criticized for saying that's too simple, just doing your life, that's awakening. But what's nice in the story is that Gikai had these profound, sudden shifts of perspective, classic awakening. That was part of his story twice, right? So that's not to be discounted. It's just that in between these moments, that there's not that many moments of profound shifts of understanding. The way to like live that shift of perspective, the way to live in the new perspective is this grandmother mind. It's just like wholeheartedly manifesting each movement of hand and foot with the dignified decorum of the Buddhas and ancestors. So, something like this. and then a little bit later, Gikai at age 40 went to China, which people were doing in those days because Zen was a new thing in Japan. If you want to like learn more about Zen, you go to the roots where it's been happening for centuries in China. And he stayed there for 3 years and visited all the noted teachers of the time. And particularly, he studied temple architecture. Because again, they're trying to establish this new tradition in Japan, like very, they want to make it very authentic. Let's learn how they set up the monastic buildings in the mother country of China, and we can, follow that way, build our temples to kind of match that style. So we take on all the elements of the lineage. I think that was the feeling of it, which is again something interesting to look at in modern America, where we're not that concerned with temple architecture. Most people, maybe some are, and maybe it's good to actually like, was there some function in the way that the buildings were set up and the way that which figures are enshrined on which altars, things like this. It'd be good to look at what was the meaning and function of that. So apparently Gikai was like traveling around China, like drawing all these pictures of altars and temples and brought them back. And I think some of them might even still be around. And then eventually when Ejo died, Tetsugikai became the next abbot of Eiheiji. And for 6 years, which was kind of unusually short time, and then he stepped down to take care of his aging mother and kind of built a hermitage next door to Eiheiji to take care of his mother. So there's some part of the history too that there was some controversy here around Gikai and why he stepped down so early from being abbot. And no one knows quite why, but there are various stories about this. One of them may be that Gikai came back from China with all these drawings and new ideas. And part of what he learned in China was Zen includes a lot of stuff. It's not just sitting. He includes like kind of esoteric rituals. Also Gikai traveled around his own country of Japan to like Shingon temples, like Vajrayana temples of Japan, and learned some of these practices, like chanting dharanis and so on. And I thought we can integrate this into our new Soto Zen practice. And some people didn't like that. That's one story. The Gikai's peers were like, Dogen taught we do a few rituals once in a while, but Dogen was really into just sitting all the time. And you're getting too elaborate with all these ceremonies, Gikai. You're watering down Dogen's pure Zen. That's one story of why they kind of like pushed him so much that eventually he had to leave. I kind of like that story because then Gikai's student became Keizan Zenji, the kind of co-founder of Soto Zen. And Keizan was totally into all these esoteric Vajrayana rituals. And that's how Keizan popularized Soto Zen. Soto Zen started spreading all over Japan, not so much because of Zazen, which was really hard for people, especially like the farmer peasants in the countryside. This might sound funny to us. They couldn't really relate to Zazen, but they could relate to all the esoteric rituals. In America, well, I think we think maybe the opposite, right? But this spreading of Soto Zen through kind of elaborate and powerful rituals was part of what worked. And it could be that Gikai kind of started that movement or trend, and that he was kind of kicked out of Eheiji because of that. That very thing that later really worked. In his time, people didn't like it. So things change. Anyway, I think history is fascinating in this way. So later, Gikai was invited to be the first abbot at Daijoji, another temple. And that's where later Keizan became the abbot of Daijoji. It wasn't all about Eheiji. They were doing their thing, sitting back at Eheiji, but maybe they were developing these rituals at Daijoji. And at age 91, people could live that long in those days, occasionally. Gikai started feeling sick, so he wrote a death poem. 7 upsets, 8 downfalls, 91 years, white reed flowers covered with snow. Day and night, the moon is full. And he sat cross-legged in zazen posture and died. So that's Tetsugikai's story and 2 of his awakenings. And I think it'd be nice to go back to this first big shift for Gikai when he heard Dogen in the hall giving this Dharma talk. Dogen was quoting the Lotus Sutra, which he liked to do. Zen is outside the scriptures, and yet sometimes you can pull out a line from scripture and in a Zen context, and it becomes a potent, pinned pop balloon of fixed perspective. So the full saying from chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra, the first section, the Dogen really picked up on this. And I think it was a Tendai thing before Dogen. Tendai people picked up on this line. The Lotus Sutra says, the Buddhas know that dharmas have no nature of their own. Again, dharmas here, phenomena, all things. All things have no nature of their own. Emptiness teaching. The Buddhas know that dharmas always have no nature of their own. the Buddha seed dependently arises. For this reason, they teach the one vehicle. This Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances in the world forever abide. That's the line that Dogen quoted. The sutra goes on. At the site of awakening, this has been known. Guiding teachers teach this with skillful means. So these Tiantai school people in ancient China, many centuries before Dogen, they were really into the Lotus Sutra. And also they were into Nagarjuna and so on, emptiness teachings. But they pick up these like lines from the sutra, almost like pull them out of context, almost like in the spirit of a critical phrase in a koan, like extract this phrase that they felt like was really juicy, and they would like really work that phrase. Before Zen had that kind of way of working with phrases. So Tiantai people like John Ram, one of the early Tiantai people, commented on this issue of Dharma position, and other Tiantai teachers talked about this line in the Lotus Sutra. Again, the line is this, or maybe we could say each Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances in the world forever abide. And I think it has a kind of koan-like flavor, partly because we think, each thing abides in its Dharma position. Maybe we get some feeling for each thing is just itself completely, right, as it is. But then this line, all the appearances in the mundane world, forms in the world as we know it, forever abide, or even eternally abide. That's like, wait a second, I thought the Buddha taught that all things in the world are totally impermanent and they don't abide for more than an instant. I think that's the juicy part of this Lotus Sutra phrase. It kind of not in it. It kind of goes against our intuition. Each Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances or forms in the ordinary world eternally abide. It's maybe sort of a comment on each Dharma abiding in its Dharma position has this kind of permanence. Each particular thing, of course, is impermanent from a certain perspective, but it has this forever, eternally abiding quality. Sounds like the Lotus Sutra is saying this. And the Tiantai people picked up on it and commented on it. And then Dogen, who started as a Tendai monk, wrote in the Genjo Koan, famously said, firewood abides in the Dharma position of firewood, which fully includes past and future, and is independent of past and future. It's firewood in this Dharma position, and then the firewood's burning, right? So then you have some ash later on where the firewood used to be. So then Dogen says, ash abides in the Dharma position of ash, which fully includes future and past and is independent of future and past. And it's a nice comment, Zen-like comment from Dogen on this line from the Lotus Sutra. Each thing, like this moment of firewood, abides in its Dharma position of firewood, and it fully includes the past, like the tree, before it was firewood, and the ash, the future of the firewood. It includes all of that. It's this dependently arising moment that depends on all the past things, and all the future things will depend on it. That's kind of a somewhat common Buddhist teaching. Each thing is dependently arisen moment that's completely interdependent with its past and future. I think that part's not so radical, but then it's totally independent of past and future. It has no past and future. That's, I think, a more unusual saying. And the Dharma position includes both. Ash abides in the Dharma position of ash, which fully includes past and future, and at the same time is independent, or even sometimes translated, cut off from past and future. Dogen comments elsewhere about this Dharma position in his Being Time essay. It's kind of an important issue for Dogen, the Dharma position, the Hoi in Japanese. And in his extensive record, Dogen has several places where he quotes the whole lines from the Lotus Sutra, a few discourses, and then comments on them. One time Dogen says, after he quotes the Lotus Sutra lines, he says, "This is the principle that only a Buddha together with a Buddha can thoroughly fathom," which is another line from chapter 2 of the Lotus Sutra. And in this particular case, Tetsugikai is sitting in the assembly, and Dogen sits on the seat for a talk. And the version that's in Dogen's extensive record says, quoting the Lotus Sutra, "Each Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances in the world forever abide. Wild geese return to the woods, and orioles appear in early spring." So that's very similar to this saying that's recorded here as the awakening story for Gikai. Maybe it was the same thing. It was some poetic spring imagery about birds, and no one could quite remember it. So it was recorded two different ways. Could be, or it could be that Dogen was just really into this theme and just, said it 2 times with the variation in this record of Gikai here is that Dogen said, "Each Dharma abides in its Dharma position. Appearances in the world forever abide. Spring colors, hundreds of red flowers. High in the willow tree, a partridge calls." So taking a kind of philosophical statement from the Lotus Sutra and making it really direct, in our face kind of imagery of birds in spring and flowers blooming, completely impermanent, right? These birds are flittering about. The flowers are dying as soon as they're blooming. We love spring because it's over just as soon as it's starting. It's fleeting. We don't call spring the beginning of summer. It's a spring is abiding in its own Dharma position. And each flower of spring is abiding in its Dharma position. And each partridge in the willow, its call is abiding in its Dharma position, which fully includes past and future. Of course, all this stuff is dependently arising, inconceivably arising to the myriad conditions. We can't get a hold of it. It's changing every moment. And everything we're doing is affecting the entire rest of the future of humanity with every thought moment. And yet, from this other perspective, nothing's happening. There is no past and future at all. This call of the partridge has no past and no future. This blooming of the red flower has no past and no future. So some scholars would probably say I'm totally wrong about this, but I'm just going to try to offer a simple definition of Dharma position. Hoi, Dharma position. Maybe one dictionary says in Sanskrit, it's Dharma niyamata. I don't know if the Sanskrit Lotus Sutra used exactly this term, but Dharma position. I would propose that Dharma position is a momentary conditioned now within unchanging, unconditioned now. Dharma position is a momentary, dependently arising, conditioned, small n, now, within the unchanging, unconditioned, capital N, now. Can you see the difference between these two types of now? The one that's totally momentary. Now, it's gone. Can't get a hold of it now. That flower just died. That partridge call just ended. I can't even remember now what it sounded like. It's done. That now is gone now. Replaced by a new now. Moment now. That's completely dependent on the past. It completely conditions the future nows in the stream of momentary nows that fully includes past and future within boundless, unconditioned, unchanging, ever-present now, eternal now. It's not a tiny moment at all. And so the partridge call within this boundless now is, in a sense, eternal. This momentary call is cut off from all past and future. From the perspective of the eternal now, there is no past and future. There never was a past and future, and there never will be a past and future. It's always the same now. And both these perspectives are true. Neither one is more true than the other. Moment. Go. Moment. Now with its past and future, and then this one call in its true reality is eternal and unchanging in its very essential expression, in its suchness, this partridge call, this red blooming flower, forever, eternally abiding. And the integration of these two perspectives simultaneously is what Gikai woke up to and directly realized. And yet, later, he was able to meditate on the saying of Dogen, body and mind dropped off. And realize that body and mind abide in their Dharma position, which fully include past and future. Every bodily experience is based on past bodily experience and will condition a future bodily experience. Every mind, moment, and thought is conditioned by the past and will condition the future, moment to moment, body and mind. And at the same time, this body and mind is just the eternal now, cut off from any possible past and future. Could be that Gikai realized that what body and mind dropped off means that body and mind abide in their Dharma position, which fully include past and future and are totally independent of past and future. Not just the partridge calls and the red flowers, but this very body and mind that we all are experiencing fully includes past and future and is completely independent of past and future. Thus, it's the ordinary way we think of our body and mind is dropped off.